There are some secrets that are so deeply buried, so meticulously hidden, they become a part of the very soil our lives are built on. You walk on them every single day, never knowing the ground beneath your feet isn't solid rock, but a fragile, hollow shell. For Amelia, that shell was her life. A life built on the unshakable foundation of a loving family, a tight-knit community, and the certainty of her own identity. My name is Alex, and on Forgotten Ties, we're here to dig up those secrets, no matter how much dust they've gathered over time. Amelia and her husband, David, lived in a quiet, idyllic neighborhood nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont. Their home, a charming farmhouse with a sprawling porch and a garden bursting with sunflowers and hydrangeas, was a testament to a life well lived. Amelia, a sculptor whose hands were always dusted with clay, had a kind, open face framed by a cascade of thick, auburn curls. David, a landscape architect with a perpetually calm demeanor and a warm smile, was her rock. Their daughter, Lily, a bright-eyed 9-year-old with a laugh that could fill the entire house, was the sun around which their world revolved. Their life was a picture of perfection, a scene straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. But as anyone who has ever looked at a photograph knows, what's happening just outside the frame is often the most important part of the story. The secret wasn't a hidden affair or a financial scandal. It was far more insidious, woven into the very fabric of who Amelia believed she was. It began, as these things often do, with a seemingly harmless curiosity. Amelia had recently inherited her grandmother's old wooden chest, a relic from a time long past. Tucked away in the attic, it was filled with moth-eaten quilts, old photographs, and the faint scent of lavender and mothballs. One rainy afternoon, with Lily at a friend's house and David working late, Amelia decided to finally go through it. She wanted to create a small tribute to her grandmother, a woman she had adored. As she sorted through the brittle, black and white photos, she came across a small, ornate box hidden beneath a stack of old letters. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a silver locket. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and intricately engraved with a single, looping initial, A. It was a beautiful piece, clearly an heirloom of some kind. But it wasn't the locket itself that sent a chill down her spine. It was the photograph inside. It was a faded, sepia-toned image of a young woman who looked uncannily like Amelia, but the date on the back, scrawled in her grandmother's shaky handwriting, was what stopped her heart. Eleanor, 1942. Amelia knew her family tree inside and out. Her grandmother, Clara, had only one sister who had passed away as a child. Her father had been an only child. There was no Eleanor. Yet, the resemblance was undeniable. The same sharp cheekbones, the same inquisitive eyes, the same distinct curve of the lips. It was like looking at her own reflection in a funhouse mirror, a distorted echo from the past. A wave of unease washed over her. It was a fleeting, illogical feeling, but it was there, a dissonant note in the perfect symphony of her life. She dismissed it as a coincidence, a trick of the light, and a faded photograph. Maybe Eleanor was a distant cousin she'd never heard of, or a friend of her grandmother's. She tucked the locket back into the box and pushed the unsettling discovery to the back of her mind. But the seed of doubt had been planted. It began to sprout in the small, quiet moments of her life. A misplaced comment from an old family friend, a momentary hesitation in her father's voice when she asked about their family history, a small detail in a story her mother told about her childhood that didn't quite add up. They were all small things, easily ignored, but they began to form a pattern, a mosaic of small cracks in the perfect facade. Amelia, ever the meticulous artist, began to see the imperfections. Her father, a stoic and reserved man named Arthur, had always been a bastion of stability. Her mother, gentle and loving, was a wellspring of comfort. Their life was a closed book, their past something solid and unchanging. But now it felt like pages were missing. The feeling of wrongness crystallized a few weeks later. Amelia was helping her mother, who was in the early stages of dementia, with her memory book. They were looking at old pictures, and her mother, her mind wandering, pointed to a picture of a young Arthur standing next to a beautiful, dark-haired woman. "That's my sister, your aunt," she said with a soft smile. Amelia's heart seized. "Mom, you don't have a sister," she said gently, her voice wavering. Her mother's face clouded over, a moment of confusion and sadness. "Of course I do. Her name was—" She trailed off, her eyes losing focus. A few seconds later, she was talking about something else entirely. It was a fleeting moment, a symptom of her illness, and Amelia tried to rationalize it away. But she couldn't. It was the second time a phantom relative had appeared in her life. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together, and the picture they were forming was nothing like the one she had always been shown. She went to her father, the one person she believed held the answers. She showed him the locket, the photograph, and told him about her mother's comment. His face, usually so composed, went pale. The color drained from his cheeks as he stared at the locket in her palm. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with an unspoken truth. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer a simple explanation. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a grief so profound it seemed to age him a decade in a single instant. He didn't have to say a word. The truth was written all over his face. He knew something. Something about a sister her mother had, a woman named Eleanor, a branch of the family tree that had been meticulously pruned away. The mystery of the locket was no longer a curiosity. It was a chilling premonition. And Amelia had just stepped onto a path from which there was no turning back. The silence that followed her father's expression was more deafening than any shout. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the crushing weight of everything left unsaid. Arthur, her pillar of strength, seemed to shrink before her very eyes, the lines on his face deepening into chasms of regret. I can't," he finally whispered, his voice a ragged whisper. "I can't tell you. Not yet. It's not my story to tell." The refusal was a gut punch. Amelia had expected a denial, a clumsy lie, anything but this shattered admission of a secret so profound he couldn't even speak its name. It was clear he was protecting someone, but who? And from what? Amelia felt her perfect world begin to crack and crumble. The foundation she had stood on her entire life was dissolving into dust. The truth, or at least the lack of it, was a physical ache in her chest. She left her parents' house that day feeling hollowed out, adrift in a sea of questions with no land in sight. She tried to talk to David, but how do you explain to the person you love most in the world that you're no longer sure who you are? He saw her distress, her haunted eyes, but he couldn't truly understand the chasm that had opened up beneath her. He was supportive, kind, and tried to distract her, but she was already on a one-way path, and there was no turning back. The little curiosities that had once been dismissed as quirks of memory or coincidence now became flashing, urgent red flags. Her mother's fleeting comment about a sister. Her father's silent grief. And the locket. Always the locket. Amelia began to obsessively research her family history, but not through the official channels. She went to the library, poring over old town records and obituaries. She spent countless hours online, searching for any mention of an Eleanor connected to her family name. The more she looked, the more she found a vacuum of information. It was as if this entire branch of the family tree had been meticulously erased from existence. The official records were clean, but the gaps, the holes where information should have been, were screaming at her. Her search led her to an unexpected place, the dusty archives of the local historical society. The curator, an elderly woman with spectacles perched on the end of her nose named Martha, had a reputation for knowing everything about everyone in the county. Amelia presented her with the old photograph and the name Eleanor. Martha's eyes, magnified by her thick glasses, widened imperceptibly. "Eleanor. I do remember that name," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It was part of a story my mother used to tell. A local legend, if you will." Martha led her to a back room, a cavern of old filing cabinets and the smell of old paper. She pulled out a brittle, yellowed file with a simple title, Hitchcock Family, Unsolved. The file wasn't much, just a collection of newspaper clippings and police reports from the 1940s. But what it contained was more than enough. It detailed the disappearance of a young woman named Eleanor Hitchcock, a vibrant, talented artist who vanished from the small town without a trace in 1942. The clippings painted a portrait of a promising life cut short. She was described as the town's darling, a bright star in their small constellation. The reports were brief and factual, listing her last known whereabouts and a dead-end police investigation. The case was closed with no suspects and no body. The town just moved on. And that was the end of the story. Or so it seemed. Amelia's hands trembled as she read the articles. The resemblance to the woman in the photograph was uncanny. Eleanor Hitchcock, the missing woman, was the woman in her locket. And the timing. 1942, the same year on the back of the photograph. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Eleanor was her mother's sister. Her mother's sister who had vanished. But the mystery wasn't just about her disappearance. It was about her family's complete, absolute, and total silence on the matter. Why had they erased her? And what did her father, Arthur, have to do with it? The more she read, the more a chilling theory began to form in her mind. Arthur had always been a man of quiet control. He was the kind of person who could keep a secret with an iron will. He had always been a force of stability, but now that stability felt less like a comfort and more like a carefully constructed wall. The articles mentioned that Arthur, a young man at the time, was a close friend of Eleanor's. They were a trio, him, her mother, and Eleanor. The clippings referred to their relationship as platonic, but the town gossip, hinted at in the articles, suggested there was more. A love triangle. A secret affair. Something that could shatter a family. Amelia went back to the only person who might be able to shed some light on the past, her mother. Her memory was a fractured mosaic, but sometimes, a single detail could shine through the haze. She sat with her, holding her hand, and asked her about Eleanor. "Tell me about your sister, Mom," she said, her voice soft. "Tell me about Eleanor." Her mother's eyes, for a moment, cleared. A flicker of recognition. A tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. "She loved him," she whispered, her voice cracking with a pain that transcended time. "She loved Arthur. But he was mine. He was supposed to be mine." And just like that, the clarity vanished, and she was gone again, back to her wandering thoughts. The words echoed in Amelia's head. He was mine. A bitter rivalry, a secret love. It painted a picture of a young woman caught between her sister and the man she loved. And then, a few months later, one of them vanished. The official file said unsolved. But what if it wasn't? What if it was something far more sinister? What if the secret her family had been hiding for decades wasn't just a matter of a missing person, but something far, far worse? The image of her father, her calm, composed father, his face shattered by grief, suddenly took on a new, terrifying meaning. He wasn't just grieving for the lost girl in the locket. He was grieving for something he had done, something he was a part of, something that had been hidden in the dark for so long it had become a phantom limb of her family, a wound that never truly healed. And Amelia was now forced to confront the chilling possibility that the man she idolized was capable of something unspeakable. The chilling realization that her father might be involved in something so terrible, something so completely antithetical to the man she had always known, was a poison seeping into every corner of her life. It wasn't a sudden, shocking event, but a slow, agonizing descent into paranoia and suspicion. Every kind word from her father felt like a mask. Every warm embrace felt like a lie. She looked at her perfect life, her beautiful home, her happy daughter, and it all felt like an illusion, built on a foundation of bone and buried secrets. David tried to reason with her, to tell her that her father was a good man, that the past was a complicated place, but his words couldn't penetrate the wall of ice that was building around her heart. The truth, she knew, was hidden in plain sight. It was in the details, the things people had tried to forget. She returned to the Historical Society, this time with a new purpose. She wasn't just looking for information, she was looking for a ghost. She asked Martha about the small details of the case, the things that weren't in the official reports. She asked about the gossip, the whispers, the things that were too scandalous to print in the paper. Martha, intrigued by her persistence, unlocked more of her vast knowledge. She remembered her mother talking about the small community of artists that Eleanor had been a part of. A small, tight-knit group that lived on the outskirts of town. She gave Amelia a name, Samuel, an old recluse who had been a young apprentice to Eleanor at the time of her disappearance. He was the last known person to have seen her. Amelia, driven by a desperate need for answers, found Samuel's address on the edge of town, a dilapidated cottage shrouded in overgrown vines. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and neglect. Samuel was a ghost of a man, his frame thin, his eyes a watery blue behind thick glasses. He was startled by her visit, but a flicker of recognition crossed his face when she mentioned Eleanor. He led her into his cluttered studio, a time capsule of a life spent in solitude. He pointed to a half-finished sculpture, still covered in a dusty sheet. She was working on that, he said, his voice raspy with age and disuse. The day she disappeared. She was supposed to come back and finish it. He pointed to a small, intricate carving of a family tree on the base of the sculpture. She told me she was going to add a new branch. A new member of the family. The words sent a jolt through Amelia. A new member of the family. Was Eleanor pregnant? The theory was chilling. A secret affair with her sister's fiancé, a pregnancy, and then a disappearance. It painted a picture of a desperate young woman and a desperate young man caught in a terrible web of their own making. But what if it wasn't a disappearance? What if it was something else? Samuel, sensing her growing fear, went on. He remembered that day with unnerving clarity. He remembered seeing Eleanor arguing with a man near the riverbank, a man he couldn't quite make out in the fading light. He remembered the man's car, a specific model, a dark sedan. It was Arthur's car, he whispered, his eyes wide with the memory. I saw him pull away. He was alone. Amelia's blood ran cold. The man in the shadows, the man her mother loved, the man who was now her father. He was there. The last person to see Eleanor alive. Her perfect, loving father was a suspect in a decades-old missing person case. The weight of this new information was crushing. She thanked Samuel, her mind reeling, and stumbled out of the cottage, the world spinning around her. She had come looking for a ghost and found a killer. She didn't know how to process it. Her entire life had been a lie. She went back to her own home, the house that now felt like a cage. She couldn't look at her father without seeing a murderer. She couldn't look at her mother without seeing a victim, a woman who had been cheated and then abandoned by a secret she couldn't remember. And she couldn't look at her own reflection without seeing a woman whose identity was a complete fabrication. She was a branch of a family tree that had been meticulously pruned away. She began to search for any other evidence, anything that could prove or disprove Samuel's account. She looked through her grandmother's old letters again, this time with a new, feverish intensity. She found one, tucked away in a small envelope, addressed to her grandmother from a man named A. The handwriting was her father's. The letter was dated a few days after Eleanor's disappearance. It was short and to the point. I have handled everything. It is done. She will not be a problem anymore. She is gone. She is not a part of us. Burn this letter. Forget this ever happened. For your sake, and for the sake of the family. The words were a hammer blow to her soul. She will not be a problem anymore. She is gone. The language was cold, devoid of emotion, a confession in black and white. It wasn't a missing person case. It was murder. And her father, her loving, kind father, had not only committed the crime, he had enlisted her grandmother in the cover-up. The perfect, loving family was nothing more than a conspiracy of silence, a web of lies so vast it had swallowed an entire human life. Amelia felt a scream building in her throat, a primal cry of pain and betrayal. The family tree didn't have a new branch. It had a missing branch, a branch that was cut and buried in the dark, and now, finally, after all these years, the soil was beginning to give way. The buried truth was finally starting to claw its way to the surface. The letter from her father was the final piece of the puzzle, a chilling, definitive end to the years of uncertainty. It wasn't a piece of the puzzle at all, but a sledgehammer that had shattered the entire mosaic of her life. Amelia didn't know how to move forward. The weight of the secret was unbearable, a crushing force that threatened to consume her. She had a choice. She could bury the truth, just as her family had for decades, and try to salvage the broken pieces of her life. Or she could expose it, rip open the decades-old wound, and let the whole, ugly truth bleed out. But what would be the cost? Her family, her husband, her daughter, their lives would be forever changed. The thought of her father, a man in his late 80s, facing the legal and social consequences of a crime he committed nearly a lifetime ago, was terrifying. But the thought of carrying this secret, of looking him in the eye and pretending nothing had happened, was a fate worse than death. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation of her own soul. Amelia knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could not live a lie. She had to unearth the truth, no matter how much it hurt. She had to give Eleanor a voice to finally, after all this time, tell her story. Amelia went to the police. She brought them the locket, the old photograph, the police reports from the Historical Society, and most importantly, the letter. The detectives, at first skeptical, grew quiet and serious as they pieced together the evidence. The case was cold, but the letter, with its undeniable handwriting and damning words, was a confession. They questioned her father, Arthur. He was old, frail, and had been living with this secret for so long it had become a part of him. When they showed him the letter, his eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of an unimaginable sadness. He finally confessed, his voice a broken whisper, to the crime that had haunted him for over 80 years. He didn't kill her. He couldn't. He had loved her. The truth was even more tragic than Amelia had imagined. Eleanor had confronted him, demanding he leave her sister and marry her. She had revealed she was pregnant with his child. Arthur, overwhelmed and terrified, had told her he could not abandon his love for Amelia's mother. In a fit of rage and despair, Eleanor had run into the path of an oncoming car. It wasn't murder. It was a terrible, unforgivable accident. But in the panic that followed, Arthur, blinded by fear and a desire to protect his reputation and his future with his love, made a terrible decision. He had moved her body and buried her in a shallow grave near the riverbank. He had forged a letter from her, pretending she had run away. And with the help of her grandmother, they had meticulously erased all traces of Eleanor from their family's history. The perfect family was not a conspiracy of silence, but a desperate act of love and fear, a crime born out of a moment of panic that had haunted them for a lifetime. Amelia's mother, in the throes of her illness, had always remembered. It was a traumatic memory so deeply ingrained in her mind that it resurfaced in her moments of confusion. She had seen the whole thing from a distance, the argument, the terrible accident, the horrifying act that followed. But in her love for Arthur, she had buried the memory, or so she thought. Her broken mind had allowed a secret to escape that her conscious mind had tried to forget. The revelation was a shockwave that tore through their family. The news hit the local papers, a decades-old mystery finally solved. Arthur was not charged with murder, but with concealing a death, a crime for which he would receive a light sentence due to his age and health. But the legal consequences were nothing compared to the emotional ones. Amelia's parents' perfect life was exposed as a web of tragic lies. Her mother's fleeting moments of confusion were now a testament to a lifetime of buried trauma. And Amelia was left to pick up the pieces of a family she no longer recognized. David was there for her, a steadfast presence in the storm. Their life was no longer perfect, but it was real. And in that reality, there was a chance for healing. The family tree had a branch she was never told about. A branch that had been cut off in a moment of panic and buried in the dark. But Amelia had brought it back to the light. The locket, once a symbol of a beautiful secret, was now a symbol of a tragic truth. Amelia had found Eleanor's final resting place, a quiet spot by the river where she had been buried all those years ago. She placed the locket on the ground, a small act of tribute to the woman she had never known, the woman who was a part of her family's tragic, complicated history. The family tree was no longer just a diagram of names and dates. It was a story. A story of love, betrayal, and a terrible secret that had haunted a family for generations. And as for me, I'm just here to tell those stories. The stories that were lost to time, the secrets that were buried with the dead. If you've been moved by Amelia's story, if you felt the weight of her discovery, please let us know in the comments. And if you want to make sure you never miss another deep dive into a family's buried past, a story that deserves to be told, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Click the like and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we unearth another one of those forgotten ties. Thank you for listening.